This week on Jerusalem Dateline, Israel shoots down a Syrian fighter jet in its airspace as the Syrian civil war rages near its border. And the U.S. and Iran ramp up a war of words. Plus, American pastor Andrew Brunson is moved out of a Turkish prison and into house arrest. But President Trump says it's not enough. Set him free. And hundreds of Jewish people from around the world make Israel their new home. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell, coming to you this week from CBN's headquarters in Virginia Beach, Virginia. Israel carried out airstrikes against Syrian positions after 2 rockets launched by ISIS landed in the Sea of Galilee. The rockets were intended for Syrian targets. This after Israel shot down a Syrian fighter jet over Israeli airspace, and Israeli forces remain on high alert as the war inside Syria rages on the Golan Heights. John Wagi has more from Jerusalem.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has made sure that Russian President Vladimir Putin knows where Israel's red lines are in Syria. And one of them is the Golan Heights, where Syrian jets are moving way too close for Israel's comfort.
Our air defense system identified a Syrian Air Force jet that took off from the T4 Syrian Air Force Base and penetrated Israeli airspace. This is a gross violation of the 1974 Separation of Forces Agreement with Syria. I have reiterated and made clear that we will not accept any such violation.
Israel is concerned about Iranian-backed forces in Syria and wants Russia to keep both Syria and Iran, 2 clear enemies of Israel, far away from the Golan border. Russia sent its top general to Jerusalem this week for still more negotiations. The Syrian pilot was reported killed in Tuesday's incident, a casualty of Syria's move to oust rebel Sunnis from the Golan. All this week, Israelis have been shaken by rocket sirens from the northern border with Syria to the southern border near Gaza. Now it appears the government is ready to spend billions of dollars to bolster the country's air and missile defense systems. The Syrian jet pilot may have strayed into Israeli territory by accident, but Israel's UN ambassador Danny Danon explained Israel can't take chances.
When we see a fighter crossing the border and we try to contact a few times and we get no response, the only thing we can do is to protect our civilians. We cannot wait to see what are the real intentions of this fighter. That's what any other country will do. We will not allow anyone to breach our sovereignty. We will not allow the Iranians to build their bases next to our borders in the Golan Heights.
Both Israel and Syria say they're not in a hurry for war. But if Syrian President Bashar Assad doesn't heed Israel's many warnings to stay away from the border, the situation could escalate quickly. John Wagi, CBN News, Jerusalem.
A Palestinian terrorist stabbed an Israeli man to death and wounded 2 others in a Jewish community outside Jerusalem. One of the victims from the settlement of Adam shot and killed the 17-year-old attacker. He was from a nearby village. Security officials conducted night searches for more terrorists but found none. Witnesses say the attacker leaped over the community's fence and ran through the street looking for victims. Israeli forces had already been on guard this week near the border with Syria and in the south near Gaza. Now they'll be on alert for more incidents near Jerusalem as well. Well, it's being called Fire and Fury Part 2. President Trump is taking to Twitter to address threats from Iran. Amber Strong has the story from Washington.
A war of words erupted over the weekend between President Trump and Iranian President Hassan Rouhani. Rouhani sending this message Sunday: America should know that peace with Iran is the mother of all peace, and war with Iran is the mother of all wars, Rouhani said. One newspaper reading, Mr. Trump, do not play with the lion's tail. Wasting no time, the president firing back late last night. Never ever threaten the United States again, or you will suffer consequences the likes of which few throughout history have ever suffered before. We are no longer a country that will stand for your demented words of violence and death. Be cautious. The battle between the U.S. and Iran reignited after the administration's decision to depart from the Iranian nuclear deal and reimpose sanctions against the regime.
The fact is, this was a horrible, one-sided deal that should have never, ever been made.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu praising the administration's tough stance.
For years, this regime was pampered by the powers, and it is good to see that the United States is changing this unacceptable equation.
Speaking before an Iranian-American group in California, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo criticizing Iran's leaders for oppressing its people and ignoring their needs.
The level of corruption and wealth among Iranian leaders shows that Iran is run by something that resembles the mafia more than a government.
And in Iran, months of protest over economic hardships and frustration with leadership.
The proud Iranian people are not staying silent about their government's many abuses. And the United States, under President Trump, will not stay silent either.
The U.S. has vowed to back the Iranian people. Amber Strong, CBN News in Washington.
Joining me to discuss the implications of Mr. Pompeo's speech and the ongoing conflicts in Syria and Iraq are CBN senior international correspondents Gary Lane and George Thomas, two of my favorite reporters. George and Gary, great to be with you on Jerusalem Dateline.
Thank you.
Pompeo's speech just a few days ago was very important. George, what was your feelings after it?
It was. I mean, it was a scathing review of this regime that has been in power for a very long time. He said next year, 2019, will be the 40-year anniversary of the Islamic Revolution launched in 1979. And Mr. Pompeo said the following. He says, 40 years fruit from the revolution has been bitter. He says 40 years of kleptocracy, 40 years of people's wealth squandered on supporting terrorism, 40 years of ordinary Iranians thrown in jail for peaceful expression of their rights. And he went through the top hierarchy of the Iranian regime and said all of these guys from Ayatollah Khamenei to the Revolutionary Guards, they're all making millions and millions of dollars at the expense of the ordinary people. So it really was a scathing attack against the regime.
And Gary, we've seen President Trump with his tweet in bold caps to Iran. Do you see war on the horizon? Do you think the Pentagon's actually preparing for war with Iran?
Chris, I think the Pentagon would say they're always prepared for war if the commander-in-chief calls them into action. I don't think at this point that Donald Trump is ready for war. I think we're hearing a lot of rhetoric back and forth from the Iranians back to the president. And, you know, Chris, this worked for Donald Trump to get the North Koreans to the bargaining table. Kim Jong-un, when he said that there would be fire and fury on the North Korean, on the Korean Peninsula if he didn't respond. So guess what? Kim Jong-un responded.
That's right.
I think this is part of his tactic to get Iran back to the negotiating table for a new deal.
Right. And George, you've been there on the streets of Tehran, inside Iran. Right now, we're seeing video coming out of Iran, not only in Tehran, but other cities. People on the streets, they're discontented. They're talking about the economy. The economy is falling. What's happening on the streets of Tehran?
No, it's it's a reality. I mean, they had hoped that with the signing of this controversial Iranian nuclear deal way back when, that in that interim time between when it was signed and when Donald Trump reneged and pulled the United States out of the deal, that they would see some economic windfall from it. But they didn't. And today the rial, the Iranian currency, has plummeted against the United States dollar. On the black market, it's selling for 3-4 times the amount. What you can buy with the rial has gone down. So, for example, eggs, oil, butter, flour, rice, all your staples that the Iranians need have skyrocketed, and people are feeling the pinch. And keep in mind, Chris and Gary, you know, the economic sanctions haven't even been put into place. They are going to tighten the screws economically on Iran very, very soon. And so the pressure is mounting on the regime. Come on, guys, we're done with this. We need to be part of the global community.
Yeah, so we're seeing conflict on the streets. And now, Gary, on the northern border, we've seen that Israel just downed a Syrian airplane, a jet military that had crossed into Israeli airspace. I mean, are we going to see a bigger conflict there between Israel and Syria?
Well, it all depends on how Syria responds. I don't know that this was on purpose, intentional. There was a lot of battling and fighting going on in the southern part of Syria, in Dara, and also in that area near the Golan Heights. So did the pilot intentionally cross into Syria, or did he just veer into Israel and then veer into Israel by accident? We don't know for certain, but we do know for certain that Israel will not tolerate any incursion into their territory, and that's why they shot him down.
George, final question to you. Do you think, one of the red lines for Israel is they want Iran's military presence out of Syria, and that's a red line for them. They're talking to Vladimir Putin about that. They're talking to the Trump administration. Is this going to be perhaps the beginning of a major conflict between Iran, Israel, and who else could be involved there inside Syria?
My sense is that Israel is not itching for a war with anybody in the neighborhood as of yet. But with this issue with what's happening in Syria, they're not necessarily concerned about Bashar al-Assad of Syria. They're more concerned about Iran continuing to grow its military presence in Syria. That is what right now is on the minds of the Benjamin Netanyahu administration. The United States has a presence in Syria as a way to checkmate the Iranian influence down in the north. So for the Israelis, it's all about curbing Iran's growing influence, not just in the neighborhoods around Israel, but specifically right next door to Syria.
And Chris, you know that they're looking to Russia for help with that.
Exactly.
Netanyahu raised that with Putin when he met him recently.
And he's met with him maybe 9 times in the past couple of years, so that's
he keeps raising it.
He does.
That's what Danny Benon told us.
Yeah, and that's really statesmanship on Netanyahu's part. George, Gary, great to be with you. Open invitation, come to Israel. We can talk more about this.
I'll be there next week if you want me to.
Very good.
Got to have a falafel there.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks for your great analysis, and we look forward to being in touch.
Thank you.
Thanks. Coming up, in Turkey, an American pastor is released to house arrest, but President Trump says it's not enough. President Trump threatened NATO ally Turkey with large economic sanctions unless detained American pastor Andrew Brunson is freed. CBN News national security correspondent Eric Rosales has the story.
It's the strongest message so far from the current administration. President Trump demands Turkey to release Pastor Andrew Brunson now. Vice President Mike Pence echoed the demand at the first ever ministerial summit to advance religious freedom.
To President Erdogan and the Turkish government, I have a message on behalf of the President of the United States of America. Release Pastor Andrew Brunson now, or be prepared to face the consequences.
President Trump spelled out the consequences in his recent tweet. The United States will impose large sanctions on Turkey for their long-term detainment of Pastor Andrew Brunson, a great Christian, family man, and wonderful human being. Turkish authorities arrested Brunson in 2016 on charges he helped plan a failed coup. The 50-year-old pastor faces up to 35 years in prison. Wednesday, a court ordered Brunson taken from prison and placed on house arrest. The vice president says that's not good enough.
Pastor Andrew Brunson is an innocent man. There is no credible evidence against him. I know that his faith will sustain him, but it shouldn't have to. Pastor Andrew Brunson deserves to be free.
Pence told the leaders of more than 80 countries the list of religious freedom violators is long. China, Iraq, and North Korea top the list. And even though President Trump is seeking better relations with North Korea, the administration continues to press the issue of religious freedom.
North Korea's persecution of Christians has no rival on the earth. It is unforgiving, systematic, unyielding, and often fatal. The mere possession of a Christian Bible is a capital offense.
At the Holocaust Museum, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Nikki Haley spoke about the U.S.'s commitment to protecting religious liberty.
We will continue to forcefully advocate for religious tolerance in the international arena, not just because so many people are being denied this right, but because defending religious freedom makes for a safer and more peaceful world for all of us.
Secretary Pompeo says the ministerial summit will not be a one-time event, but an annual event under the Trump administration. Eric Rosales, CBN News, Washington.
While Turkey's Erdogan spouts hatred against Israel, one of the Jewish state's best friends is speaking out on her behalf. CBN's David Brody talked with U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, on the sidelines of the Christians United for Israel conference in Washington.
When it comes to supporting Israel, you're going to be hard-pressed to find a bigger defender than Nikki Haley. Her passion was on display Monday evening in front of the influential evangelical group Christians United for Israel.
Let me tell you, it's a new day at the UN.
From now on, every country knows that the United States will not just block anti-Israel measures, we will shine a light on those who are responsible. There won't be any more free passes for those who bully Israel at the UN.
Haley's time at the UN has been marked by a full-throttle defense of Israel. In an interview with CBN News, she expressed excitement to see that the hard work is beginning to pay off as skeptical UN members begin to see the anti-Israel terrorist group Hamas for what it is.
The idea that we could get the majority of the General Assembly for the first time to even acknowledge that Hamas is an issue was a fantastic win.
Haley also sees a winning team in the support evangelicals have shown Israel for decades.
When you look at the anti-Semitism, you look at all of the harassment that they're getting around the world, you do feel for them because you know these are good people trying to live a good life that are in a dangerous region. And I think that Christians United, they see that for what it is.
She's also calling out certain United Nations bodies and their questionable decisions.
The Human Rights Council is a farce.
She got the U.S. to pull out, calling it full of hypocrisy.
What we've said is you've got serious human rights abuses, whether it's in Venezuela, whether it's in Iran where they're protesting their regime, whether it's in Nicaragua, and they're doing nothing about it.
The phrase doing nothing is not in Ambassador Haley's vocabulary.
Since day one, you've gone in there to shake things up. How tough has that been?
Every day I put on body armor because I know there's going to be a fight. I'm just fighting a different thing every day.
Often on that daily agenda, Iran, Russia, and dealing with North Korea.
Do you think they understand the message that what denuclearization means to the United States?
I think that North Korea understands the message, they just don't like to hear it. We're not going to loosen sanctions. We're not going to do congratulatory statements until we see actions to stand by their words that they're going to denuclearize. And I think they've got some soul searching to do.
On the Russia front, she's okay with President Trump talking to Vladimir Putin, even in private, despite some of the criticism.
He did that with Kim. He's done it with other leaders. He did it with President Xi of China, and that's just his way. He feels like he can get more out of them if he goes one-on-one like that. It's his style. It's the way he does it. You can't get to the end of the other side if you don't have those conversations.
Despite the appearance of friendly talking with Russia, she makes one thing perfectly clear.
We don't trust Russia. We don't trust Putin. We never will. They're never going to be our friend. That's just a fact.
Iran fits that category as well, especially after its president, Hassan Rouhani, warns Americans that a war with Iran would be the mother of all wars.
Iran has made or has received their legitimacy by rhetoric. It has the Europeans and everyone that was involved in the Iran deal scared of what they might do. We don't fall for that.
The world is indeed a dangerous place, and it has Nikki Haley keeping the faith.
We just have to keep doing our part, and we have to make sure that we're being true to ourselves, true to our values, true to what we believe in, and not compromise on that. And I have faith it's all going to work out in the end.
David Brody, CBN News, Washington.
Up next, hundreds of Jewish people from around the world choose to make Israel their home. Hundreds of Jewish immigrants landed at Israel's Ben Gurion Airport this week, including more than 200 North American immigrants. CBN senior editor John Wagi was on hand for one arrival, where both Jewish and Christian leaders gave them a joyous welcome.
In Hebrew, it's called Aliyah, or going up to the land of Israel. And these immigrants are joining thousands of other Israelis who have made Aliyah in the 70 years since Israel became a modern nation. Both outgoing Jewish Agency Chairman Natan Sharansky and the new chairman, Isaac Herzog, were on hand to greet them.
Nearly 200 of these brand new, soon-to-be Israelis are from France, and many of them are children. France is just one of a number of countries in Europe and throughout the globe where the danger to Jews is growing.
It's very concerning what's happening in Western Europe, also in other parts of the world where you can see anti-Semitism rising its ugly head, whether it's in the form of anti-Semitism or anti-Israel sentiments, which are basically just masking anti-Semitism.
Moore says the Jewish Agency has kept a promise since Israel became a nation 70 years ago.
Never again will there be a Jewish person who is in danger, who is full of hope, who wants to come to Israel, but the doors are closed.
Thierry Haddad, a pianist, says radical Muslim anti-Jewish violence was a factor in his move.
It's more and more true. Also, the politics try to protect, but it's difficult.
Sarah Rachel Levy came alone from Paris. She says anti-Semitism didn't drive her out. It was more of a calling.
I would be with my people and my God on my land. It was an obligation for me. If I didn't do that, it's like I am dead. I don't know how to say.
Christian leaders also played a role in the welcome ceremony. They've been helping Jewish immigrants get to Israel for decades. Why? Tom Hess, director of the All Nations Convocation in Jerusalem, says the 700 references to Aliyah in the Bible make it clear it's something close to God's heart.
It says in the scriptures that God will bring his people back from the north, the south, the east, and the west. Most of the Jews have come from the north and the south and the east, but 90% of the Jews outside of Israel today are in the west. So we know there's going to be a massive Aliyah, not only continuing from the north, but from the west, God will bring back millions and millions of Jews.
John Wagi, CBN News, Tel Aviv.
Coming up, celebrating the life of King David in a light show in Jerusalem. That's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Thanks for joining us. Remember, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. We'll leave you today with sights and sounds from the life of King David, part of a new light show at the Tower of David Museum in Jerusalem. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.